She did that phony curtsy, and then with a squeaky voice said, "I'm so pleased to see you, Your Majesty."
Meghan believed everything was finally falling into place exactly as planned, with major moves carefully aligned, a powerful brand strategy ready to dominate headlines, and a new business empire positioned to capture global attention in a way that would mark a defining shift in her trajectory. But almost without warning, that momentum was disrupted by a sudden and unexpected turn that no one on the outside could have predicted. What makes this even more intense is the claim that behind closed doors, far from the public eye, serious discussions were already unfolding at a high level in the UK Parliament, and when the outcome began to surface, it left many completely stunned, transforming what was meant to be a smooth and confident rollout into a situation that hit an abrupt and undeniable wall, triggering one question that quickly spread everywhere. How did something that looked so carefully constructed start to unravel this fast? According to sources, this was not just a minor obstacle or a temporary delay, but something far more significant that could carry consequences well beyond what anyone initially expected.
You can't defend them anymore. You know, Harry, I defended him all along, said, look, he's protected his country, he's served his country.
This development is being described as something powerful enough to disrupt her entire strategy in a major way, and the reaction online has been nothing short of explosive, with some people expressing genuine shock at how quickly everything shifted, while others are calling it long overdue, suggesting that cracks had been forming for a while beneath the surface. At the same time, a growing number of voices have started digging deeper into details that were never meant to be front and center, pulling attention toward areas that were likely expected to remain out of sight, and turning this into something far bigger than just a business issue. What makes it even more intense is that this situation is no longer limited to strategy or branding. It has crossed into something far more layered, where personal stakes, political undertones, and public perception are all colliding at once, creating a moment that is becoming increasingly difficult to contain as every new development adds fuel to the narrative. So now the focus shifts to the core of it all. What actually unfolded inside Parliament? Who decided to step in at this exact moment? And why now, when the timing seems almost too precise to ignore? And more importantly, what does this mean for what comes next, especially when every move from here will be watched more closely than ever before? Before we break everything down, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Palace Loop so you don't miss what's coming next, because the details ahead reveal an angle that most people are completely overlooking. While Meghan remained in the spotlight through interviews, appearances, and high-visibility projects, there are growing suggestions that behind the scenes, Prince William was operating on an entirely different level, making moves far from the public eye that could now be playing a much bigger role than anyone initially realized. No public noise, no visible confrontations, no back and forth playing out in front of cameras, just a series of quiet decisions being made over time behind palace walls, stacking one after another in a way that most people would never notice until the impact suddenly becomes impossible to ignore.
She didn't want to have to walk behind Kate Middleton, you know, the future queen. She felt that they should be treated as equal.
He writes, Harry reignites war with William, blindsiding his brother with announcement of a Toronto trip.
And this is exactly where the situation begins to take a much sharper turn, because while King Charles has often been associated with a more forgiving approach, showing willingness to revisit situations and leave room for second chances, Prince William is said to operate with a completely different mindset, one that prioritizes long-term stability above all else, even if that means making difficult and highly calculated decisions that others might hesitate to take. His focus appears to be centered on protecting the future of the crown at any cost, and according to growing speculation, the steps being taken behind the scenes are not random or reactive, but part of a much larger structure that is quietly being put into place with precision and intent. And here is where it becomes especially significant, because with a single decisive move, the very title that Meghan became widely recognized for could potentially take on a very different meaning in the future, reshaping how it is perceived and used. Once you begin to understand how these institutional systems actually operate, it becomes clear why overlooking subtle signals can lead to major consequences, as what might seem minor on the surface can quickly evolve into something far more impactful. This is not about personal conflict or settling old scores, but rather about a shift in control that appears to be unfolding in real time, redefining the balance in ways that are only now starting to come into focus. And while others are still reacting to what's already happened, William appears to be thinking several steps ahead, quietly setting things into motion with a level of precision that suggests long-term planning rather than short-term response, creating a contrast that is becoming harder to ignore as events continue to unfold. Charles, on the other hand, has long been known for favoring a calm and measured approach, one rooted in dialogue, patience, and the belief that even the most difficult situations can be resolved through quiet conversations behind closed doors, maintaining stability without escalating tension.
I've said forever that all it takes is a letter's patent to remove royal titles if the king really wishes to do so.
It's a mindset shaped over decades, influenced by tradition and the idea that preserving unity within the family is always worth the effort. And to many, that perspective carries a sense of logic and weight that feels both reasonable and familiar. The belief that issues should be worked through rather than confronted publicly sounds right in principle, and for a long time, it has defined how situations like this are handled at the highest level. But William's perspective has been forming over years of watching how these dynamics play out. And from where he stands, that softer, more forgiving approach may no longer be enough to deal with the scale of what is happening now. Instead of seeing resolution, he appears to see patterns repeating, and rather than relying on methods that prioritize harmony, he seems focused on ensuring that control, structure, and long-term stability are not compromised, even if that means stepping away from the traditional way of handling things. From William's perspective, the concern is that allowing things to continue without firm boundaries only gives the situation more space to grow, and instead of easing the pressure, it seems to build with every new interview.
I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry especially.
Every headline and every wave of public attention that follows, while the institution itself is left to absorb the impact again and again. According to ongoing discussions, there has even been mention of a tense and deeply private exchange between them, a moment where the difference in approach was no longer subtle but clearly spoken, with William reportedly expressing the belief that too much leniency could be doing more harm than good, not just in the moment but in the long term as well. It is in moments like that where the divide becomes impossible to ignore, because they are facing the same situation but through completely different lenses, each shaped by their own priorities and experiences. Charles continues to view everything through a deeply personal and family-centered perspective, where relationships still hold meaning beyond the public narrative, and where the connection to Harry, Meghan, and the grandchildren is not something that can simply be set aside or reduced to strategy. For him, this is not just about image or control, but about bonds that were built over a lifetime, making his position rooted in emotion as much as responsibility, and when seen from that angle, it becomes much easier to understand why he leans toward preserving those ties, even when the circumstances surrounding them are becoming increasingly complicated. But from William's point of view, the focus is no longer just on relationships, it's on protecting the larger structure that has allowed the institution to endure for generations. A system that has survived precisely because it knew when to adapt, when to reinforce its boundaries, and when to make difficult decisions in order to preserve long-term stability. Where Charles sees personal connections that still carry deep meaning, William is said to see a growing pressure point, one that could continue to expand if clear limits are not established, turning what might seem manageable now into something far more difficult to contain later on. And this is where things become even more interesting, because what most people are not noticing is that William is not simply observing and waiting for the future to unfold. He is already actively shaping it behind the scenes.
We're just doing it the same way that we would want if we were employees of it. Right?
Reports suggest that a quiet but highly informed circle is being brought together, made up of individuals who understand royal history in depth and insiders who know exactly how the system operates at its core, allowing for a level of strategic planning that is far more deliberate than anything visible to the public. This is not about creating noise or escalating tensions, but about building a clear and structured direction moving forward, one that focuses on defining roles with precision, who officially represents the institution and who remains part of the wider family circle, because right now, those lines appear increasingly blurred, influenced more by long-standing tradition than by clearly enforced rules, and that ambiguity may be exactly what is now being addressed. William's approach is centered on removing uncertainty entirely, eliminating any room for confusion, mixed messaging, or blurred lines that could weaken how the institution is perceived, because from his perspective, clarity is not just important, it is essential for long-term stability. When you break it down, the idea behind this strategy is surprisingly straightforward, yet incredibly powerful, focusing on giving the future monarch full authority to clearly define who holds an official role and who does not, without leaving space for ongoing debates, emotional influence, or external pressure to shape those decisions over time. It is a framework built not on personal feelings, but on structure, responsibility, and a clear understanding of what the role is meant to represent. At the core of this thinking is a simple but firm principle: those who actively work in service of the crown retain the titles and responsibilities that come with it, while those who choose to step outside that system and build an independent path are free to do so, but without expecting the institution to adapt around that decision or extend its framework beyond its intended boundaries. It is a direct and calculated approach that reflects a broader belief that if the crown is meant to symbolize strength, consistency, and authority, it cannot afford to be stretched too far in an attempt to include everyone, because the more selective and clearly defined it remains, the more meaning and value it carries, whereas once that distinction begins to blur, it risks losing the very identity that has allowed it to endure for so long. What this ultimately comes down to is not about being cold or turning things into something personal.
Oh, Ms. Markle, you ain't fooling anyone. We just know that you're listening. Yes, that's
But about reinforcing the very foundation that has kept the monarchy stable for generations, ensuring that it can continue to function with clarity and purpose in a rapidly changing world. From this perspective, William is not attempting to dismantle the system or disrupt its core identity, but rather to refine it with careful precision, holding on to the elements that still provide strength while adjusting those that no longer serve the same purpose, all with the intention of securing its long-term resilience. And part of that process involves drawing firm boundaries that may have been avoided for years, not out of indifference, but because the time to define them clearly had not yet fully arrived, until now. This is also the point where things begin to shift more noticeably behind palace doors, because what is happening is no longer just theoretical discussion or quiet observation, but an active reworking of how the system itself could operate moving forward. Instead of relying solely on tradition as the guiding force, the focus appears to be shifting toward a more structured and modern framework, one that aligns with the realities of today rather than expectations formed decades ago. At the center of this shift is a redefinition of what it actually means to be royal, separating the idea of family identity from official responsibility so that being part of the family no longer automatically translates into representing the crown, creating a clearer and more sustainable model that reflects both continuity and necessary evolution at the same time. In this evolving structure, the spotlight would no longer be something automatically extended based on connection, but instead carefully reserved for those who actively carry out public duties and represent the institution in a direct and consistent way, ensuring that visibility aligns with responsibility rather than assumption. Titles and recognition under this approach would be clearly tied to that role and the work behind it, rather than simply being linked to family association, creating a system where meaning is reinforced through action rather than expectation.
Meghan Markle, to me, has lost all sense of reality about life.
And for those who choose a different direction, whether that involves private business, entertainment, or independent ventures, that path would remain entirely separate, without overlap or confusion, removing the blurred lines that have previously made it difficult to distinguish between personal branding and official representation. What makes this shift even more precise is the level of research and planning reportedly happening behind the scenes, with those close to the process suggesting that careful comparisons are being made with other royal households, analyzing what has worked effectively, what has led to complications, and how similar challenges have been handled elsewhere. The goal appears to be avoiding the kind of gray areas that can create long-term uncertainty, because even a single unclear rule has the potential to open the door to ongoing confusion, making it essential to build a system that is not only clear in the present, but strong enough to hold its structure well into the future. The direction being shaped here is centered on creating a system that is clean, controlled, and easy to understand, where authority ultimately rests with the monarch and decisions are made based strictly on who is actively serving in an official capacity rather than on legacy or personal connection alone. This approach is not just theoretical, as there are indications that it has been examined in practical, everyday scenarios, outlining how core members who carry out public responsibilities would remain clearly positioned at the forefront, while others would continue as part of the wider family without stepping into roles that formally represent the crown. And within these ongoing discussions, one idea continues to surface repeatedly, reinforcing the foundation of everything being considered. That idea is simple but powerful. If the crown is meant to retain its value, it cannot be expanded to include everyone without losing what makes it distinct. At the center of this entire shift is the goal of preserving royal status as something rare, defined, and meaningful, rather than something that becomes diluted through overextension. Because once that line begins to blur and the title is spread too widely, its impact naturally begins to fade, and with it, the sense of authority and significance that has historically set it apart. This approach is not being framed around emotion or personal dynamics, but around long-term thinking and one central question: what actually keeps the monarchy strong and stable in the future when everything around it continues to evolve? And the conclusion William appears to return to again and again is the need for clear, non-negotiable limits that cannot be bent or reinterpreted depending on the situation, creating a structure that holds its shape no matter the pressure placed on it. Part of this thinking has reportedly involved looking outward, studying how other royal families in countries like Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands have already adapted to modern expectations, drawing from systems that prioritize clarity, defined roles, and a more streamlined representation of the institution.
The extraordinary release of a bombshell book on the royal family.
This is also the exact point where his approach begins to clearly separate from Charles, because rather than trying to soften outcomes or find a middle ground that keeps everyone included, William's direction is described as far more fixed and structured, almost like a rulebook that is designed to apply consistently across all scenarios without exception. Where Charles may lean toward inclusion and maintaining harmony, William appears focused on setting firm standards that do not shift based on circumstance, ensuring that there is no special treatment and no flexibility that could weaken the system over time. And in that view, if someone chooses not to align with those standards, that remains their decision, but the structure itself does not change, because from his perspective, the strength of the monarchy depends on its ability to remain consistent rather than adaptable in ways that could compromise its core identity. From this perspective, the role is not something that can be stepped into or out of depending on personal plans or changing priorities, but rather a clearly defined position with firm expectations attached to it, where commitment is absolute and consistent rather than flexible or selective. The idea being reinforced is simple yet strict. You are either fully dedicated to carrying out the responsibilities that come with representing the crown, or you step away entirely and pursue a separate path without expecting to move back and forth between the two. And this is where the situation becomes even more significant, because what is being discussed is not just theoretical or based on opinion, but something that could be formalized through an established mechanism that already exists within the system. At the center of this possibility is a powerful tool known as letters patent, which might sound like routine administrative paperwork on the surface, but in reality holds the authority to reshape key elements of the monarchy with remarkable precision. With a single document and the approval it requires, titles can be adjusted, roles can be redefined, and the very definition of who is officially recognized within the structure can be altered in a way that takes immediate effect. History has already demonstrated just how impactful this mechanism can be, most notably in 1917, when King George V used it to streamline the royal circle, reducing the number of individuals holding official status and establishing clear boundaries in one decisive move, instantly changing how the structure was understood and leaving some who were once considered within that circle on the outside of it almost overnight. There are no drawn-out debates in this kind of system, no prolonged public back and forth or gradual transitions that unfold over time, but instead a direct and decisive reset when needed, because that is how the institution has always operated at its core.
Prince Harry flaunts his family wealth in a latest cringeworthy bid to overshadow.
The authority ultimately rests with the sovereign, meaning no external approval is required, and with a single decision followed by one signature, changes can be implemented in a way that is immediate and final, locking in a new structure without delay. What many people tend to overlook, however, is that the major adjustment made in 1917 was never intended to be a permanent and unchangeable framework, but rather a foundation that future monarchs could revisit and modify whenever circumstances demanded it. And history has already shown that these kinds of updates are not only possible, but have happened more than once. And this is where the situation begins to take another significant turn, because there is increasing discussion suggesting that a modern version of this mechanism may already be taking shape behind the scenes, not just as an idea being explored, but as something structured and prepared in advance should the moment arise where it needs to be put into action. The direction of such an update appears to be clear, focused, and strict. Only those fully committed to carrying out official duties would retain their titles and formal standing, while others would remain part of the family in a personal sense, but without being connected to official royal status. When you consider how quickly something like this could be implemented, it becomes clear just how transformative it could be, as there would be no lengthy process or extended negotiations, but simply one approval that instantly reshapes the entire structure in a way that is both immediate and far-reaching. That is where the real weight of this mechanism begins to reveal itself, because the same authority that grants status within the crown also holds the power to redefine it just as quickly, and once you understand that, the potential impact becomes impossible to ignore. If a document like this were ever finalized, it would not just adjust internal structures, but could significantly reshape how certain figures are perceived in the public space, especially when a large part of that identity has been closely tied to a specific royal title. In Meghan's case, much of her global recognition has been connected to the title of Duchess, and if the official standing behind that title were to shift in any meaningful way, the perception surrounding it could begin to change as well, altering how it is received across different platforms and audiences. To be clear, the personal connection would remain unchanged, as she would still be married to a prince, and that aspect would not disappear. But without the same level of formal recognition or institutional backing, the influence typically associated with those titles might not carry the same weight or presence in every setting.
What William has done in this discussion with Eugene Levy, the star of Schitt's Creek, is address a lot that he has been unable to say.
When you look at how things are structured right now, a significant portion of her public image is linked to that royal association, from business partnerships to media appearances, where that connection often plays a role in how she is introduced and positioned. She is frequently presented as someone occupying a rare space connected to royalty while simultaneously building an independent path, and it is precisely that combination that could be affected if the foundation behind it were to be redefined. That contrast has played a major role in shaping how she stands out, creating a unique positioning that blends royal association with independent ambition, and in many ways, that combination has helped open doors that may not have been as accessible otherwise. You can see it reflected clearly in how her name is presented across various projects, where the inclusion of her title has consistently been part of the framing, not as a small detail, but as a defining element of the overall image that reinforces a sense of distinction and status. It is not just a label attached to her name, but a core piece of how her public identity has been built and understood across different platforms and audiences. Now imagine that foundation beginning to shift quietly in the background, not through dramatic headlines or public confrontations, but through something far more subtle and official, such as a formal adjustment in how titles are recognized and applied. A single change like that could trigger a ripple effect, raising new questions that would naturally follow. How might this influence future opportunities? What changes in how projects are positioned? And how does perception evolve when introductions no longer carry the same title that once defined that presence? The interest might still be there, but whether it carries the same impact becomes a different question entirely. And that is where the real shift begins to take shape. Because in a fast-moving public space, even a small change in identity can alter how everything is received and interpreted moving forward. In today's fast-moving landscape, new faces rise almost overnight, trends shift without warning, and the spotlight constantly moves from one name to the next, rarely staying in one place for long. But the monarchy operates on an entirely different level, built on history, tradition, and a form of recognition that has been established over generations, creating a presence that still holds a distinct space within media and public life. And while both worlds can overlap at times, there is a clear difference between celebrity and royalty, because one relies heavily on continuous visibility and public attention to maintain relevance, while the other carries a depth of legacy and structure that does not fade in the same way.
I hope we don't go back to some of the practices in the past that Harry and I had to grow up in. I think it's safe to say that change is on my...
Even as the surrounding environment continues to evolve. What makes this situation even more striking is how quietly such a significant shift could take place, without the need for major announcements or dramatic public moments, but instead through a low-key update delivered through official channels that simply confirms how titles and roles are defined moving forward. And just like that, without noise or buildup, the entire dynamic could change almost instantly, altering perception in a way that feels subtle at first, but carries a deep and lasting impact once it fully settles in. Now, when you look at how the entertainment and media world actually operates, everything comes down to positioning and perceived value, because it is never just about personality alone, but about what truly sets someone apart in an environment that is already saturated with recognizable names competing for the same attention. Meghan's image has long been built around a very specific and rare combination, a figure who stepped into royal life and still carries that association while simultaneously pursuing an independent path. And it is exactly that contrast that helped her stand out and create opportunities that might not exist under more typical circumstances. But if that balance begins to shift, the conversation around her naturally starts to evolve as well, not from an emotional standpoint, but from a purely strategic and business-driven perspective, where the key question becomes what now defines her unique position and what continues to separate her from others operating in the same space. There are already discussions suggesting that brands and potential partners may begin to look more closely at that distinction, evaluating what makes her different in a market filled with strong competition, because without that royal connection leading the narrative, the positioning starts to move closer toward that of a general public figure, where the landscape is far more crowded and competitive. And while the pursuit of independence, stepping away from rigid expectations, constant scrutiny, and structured limitations, can initially feel like the right move, it often comes with trade-offs that are not immediately visible, but gradually reveal themselves over time as the full impact of that shift begins to unfold. Because in many ways, the very institution she chose to step back from was also a major force behind the level of visibility and recognition she initially gained, meaning that the connection itself played a key role in building that spotlight from the beginning. And once that link begins to shift or weaken, the impact does not always require a direct response from the palace to be felt. Instead, the adjustment can happen more naturally as the public space and the business world start to recalibrate on their own, quietly reassessing where things stand and how much influence that connection still holds in shaping perception, opportunities, and overall positioning. And this is where William's mindset starts to make more sense, because it is not based on impulse or reaction, but on observing how similar situations have been handled elsewhere, studying systems that have already faced comparable challenges and made decisive changes.
Prince William has in the past fortnight seized control of the British monarchy from a weak and dying King Charles.
One example that has drawn particular attention is what happened in Denmark a few years ago, when Queen Margrethe II made a move that caught many people off guard by removing royal titles from 4 of her grandchildren in a single decision, not as a response to conflict, but as a way to bring clarity to the structure. Her reasoning was direct and practical. Too many titles were creating confusion about who truly represented the monarchy and who remained part of the extended family, and by addressing that, she aimed to strengthen the system rather than complicate it further. So in that case, the structure was simplified in a way that removed confusion entirely, and this is exactly where the connection becomes much clearer, because William is said to have followed that situation closely, observing not just the decision itself, but how it unfolded in real time, how the public responded, and how the entire process was handled step by step. What made it especially significant was that it transformed the concept from a theoretical idea into a real-world example of a modern monarchy taking a firm and clearly defined action, showing that such changes were not only possible, but could actually be implemented within a system built on tradition. At first, the reaction was far from universally positive, with some viewing the move as overly strict or even uncomfortable, particularly because it involved changes within the family itself, which naturally sparked debate and drew attention for a period of time. But as the situation settled, something began to shift, and the outcome revealed a structure that was more streamlined and easier for the public to understand, where it became immediately clear who was actively representing the crown and who was not part of that role. What appears to have stood out the most was not just the decision, but the way it was executed, quietly, decisively, and without dragging on through endless explanations or attempts to satisfy every perspective, creating a clean break that allowed the system to move forward without lingering uncertainty. The decision was made, communicated clearly, and that was the end of it, with no prolonged back and forth or attempts to revisit it repeatedly, allowing the system to adjust quickly while the family adapted and everything continued moving forward without disruption. And that outcome seems to be the key takeaway that has remained, reinforcing the idea that strong institutions do not wait until situations become complicated or difficult to manage, but instead act early, setting direction before uncertainty has the chance to grow. According to ongoing reports, William has taken this approach seriously, reaching beyond one example and connecting with individuals across Europe who understand how modern monarchies function today, gathering insight not from a single model, but from multiple systems that have already faced similar questions and made their own adjustments. This includes looking closely at countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, and Spain, analyzing how each has approached the balance between tradition and modernization, and what outcomes those decisions have produced over time. At the center of all this is one recurring question: how do you remain relevant in a rapidly changing world without losing the unique identity that defines the monarchy in the first place? That balance is where everything becomes critical, because leaning too heavily on tradition can slow necessary progress, while removing too much can risk weakening the very essence of what makes the institution distinct. And through all these examples, one consistent pattern continues to stand out.
This woman is a fraud, and people get it. She's not special. She's not a feminist icon.
The systems that appear strongest are those with clear and defined structures, where it is immediately understood who officially represents the crown and who remains part of the wider family without holding that formal role. No confusion, no overlap, no mixed roles, just a clear structure that defines everything without leaving room for interpretation. And Denmark demonstrated that a move like this does not weaken the institution, as some might expect, but can actually strengthen it, reinforcing respect precisely because the decision is direct and easy to understand. And while all of this has been unfolding quietly in the background, without major announcements or public focus, there are now growing signs that conversations around possible changes are beginning to surface in wider circles, gradually moving from private discussions into something that is harder to ignore. At first, it sounded like the usual kind of palace chatter that comes and goes without leading to anything concrete, the type of speculation that people hear often and rarely take seriously. But over time, the tone began to shift in a noticeable way. The whispers became more specific, more detailed, and increasingly difficult to dismiss, as if something behind the scenes was beginning to take clearer shape. What once felt like casual talk has started to evolve into something more focused, with reports of conversations intensifying, meetings taking place out of public view, and attention slowly turning toward what could come next. And now that question is everywhere. What happens from here, especially when it is widely understood that a significant part of her public image remains closely tied to that royal connection, making any potential shift far more impactful than it might initially appear? so the focus naturally shifts toward thinking ahead, exploring different options, protecting what has already been built, and staying prepared for outcomes that could reshape everything moving forward. And within those discussions, one idea begins to stand out more than the rest. What if the title, Duchess of Sussex, could be positioned as a brand in its own right, something officially registered and controlled as a business identity that exists independently from the traditional royal framework? At first glance, it sounds like a strategic and forward-thinking move, turning recognition into a long-term asset that could operate beyond institutional limits. But this is exactly where the situation becomes far more complex, because that kind of approach brings challenges that are not easily navigated. What makes it even more significant is that the palace was not caught off guard by this line of thinking, but was already prepared well in advance, with advisors having quietly reinforced boundaries around how royal titles can be used, particularly in commercial contexts. There were no loud statements, no public pushback, and no visible tension, just established systems stepping in exactly as they were designed to do, relying on guidelines that have been in place for years, ready to be applied the moment they became relevant. One insider reportedly described the situation in a way that captures the contrast perfectly, suggesting that while one side was exploring branding possibilities, the other had already mapped out the entire scenario several steps ahead, highlighting just how calculated and structured the response had been from the very beginning. And those possibilities were effectively stopped before they could even take shape, closing off potential paths at an early stage rather than allowing them to develop into something more complex. The message behind it did not need to be repeated or emphasized loudly because it was already built into the structure itself. Titles originate from the crown, and control over how they are used remains firmly within that same system, making it clear that separating that status from its source is not something that aligns with how everything is designed to function.
Prince William, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, can be very angry, and rightly so, many say, behind the scenes.
From that point on, the situation is said to have intensified, not in a public or dramatic way, but through a noticeable shift in tone, reflecting a much firmer and more controlled approach. This is where William's strategy becomes even more visible, built around clearly defined limits that leave no room for alternative paths, workarounds, or exceptions, reinforcing a system where the rules apply consistently, regardless of circumstance. As a result, the pace of developments behind the scenes appears to have accelerated, with more discussions taking place, more planning happening out of view, and increasing pressure to determine the next move, yet every direction seemed to circle back to the same outcome, blocked before it could fully begin. And that leads to the key question of how the palace was able to respond so effectively and so quickly, which ultimately comes down to long-term planning and preparation, rather than reacting in the moment, ensuring that when the situation arose, the framework to handle it was already firmly in place. William's team is said to have spent years preparing for situations exactly like this, building a level of readiness that goes far beyond simple reaction. By bringing in individuals who understand every layer of how the system operates from the inside out. These are not just standard advisors, but highly experienced figures who have studied the structure in depth, examining every angle, anticipating potential scenarios, and identifying even the smallest gaps that could be tested or used over time, ensuring that nothing is left to chance. And instead of waiting until pressure builds and then responding, the approach has been to move early, setting everything in place long before it becomes necessary to act. That is the key detail that changes everything, because it means no new framework needed to be created in the moment, as the structure was already established and ready to be used when the situation called for it. The real advantage came from understanding exactly how and when to apply those mechanisms with precision, turning preparation into immediate action. Over the years, there have been multiple attempts by different figures to test the boundaries surrounding royal titles and their broader influence, and each time, the system has quietly adapted, reinforcing itself by adding new layers of protection that ensure it remains stable and difficult to bypass, no matter how circumstances evolve. Those layers of protection were never removed or forgotten. They were simply sitting in the background, built into the system, and largely unnoticed until a moment like this brought them back into focus, revealing just how much had already been prepared over time. William's team is said to have gone deep into historical records, revisiting past rulings and pulling forward principles that still carry authority today, almost like rediscovering tools that had always been available but rarely needed to be used in such a direct way. And what stands out just as much as the preparation itself is how quietly everything has been handled, with no dramatic headlines, no direct confrontations, and no visible escalation, but instead, a controlled and deliberate framing of these moves as part of a broader effort to modernize and bring clarity to the system. In today's environment, that shift in messaging makes a significant difference because it changes how everything is perceived, presenting the situation not as something aimed at any one individual, but as an update to the structure itself, designed to strengthen and simplify how it functions moving forward. The outcome may lead to major changes, but the tone remains measured and strategic, which makes it far more difficult to openly challenge, especially when it is all grounded in long-standing tradition and established authority. This is how the monarchy has historically maintained its stability, by adapting from within its own framework rather than reacting outwardly. And for those who understand how influence and power truly operate behind the scenes, this kind of quiet, calculated shift is often far more impactful than anything that plays out publicly. For those who have been closely observing how the system operates, this direction has not come as a surprise, because advisors, historians, and protocol experts have reportedly seen this shift building for years, not as something sudden, but as the continuation of an idea that has existed for a long time: a smaller, more focused monarchy designed to function with clarity and purpose in a modern world. Nothing about this has been created overnight, and every angle that might have been explored externally appears to have already been anticipated internally, with rules and structures in place long before they were needed, including strict limitations around how titles can be used and what they represent. Attempts to separate or independently redefine that status do not align with how the system is built, because everything ultimately traces back to the crown, and even discussions about fairness tend to circle back to historical precedent, where similar decisions have already set the tone. This is how institutions operate under pressure, not through reaction or emotion, but through structured systems that continue to function exactly as they were designed to. Now, after everything that has unfolded publicly, there is a noticeable shift in the atmosphere, with a more controlled and steady energy emerging from the palace, signaling a move away from reacting toward actively leading, and people are beginning to recognize that change. Even those who once questioned the relevance of the monarchy are starting to view it through a different lens, as the strategy behind these quiet but deliberate moves becomes harder to overlook. William is no longer perceived as operating in the background, but as someone shaping outcomes with precision, making calculated decisions without turning them into public spectacle, and that alone marks a significant shift in how everything is being handled. His approach has remained consistent: stay composed, avoid unnecessary noise, and allow the system to carry out its role without distraction, resulting in a monarchy that now appears more focused, more clearly defined, and guided by a stronger sense of direction than before.
Are now pulling in a completely different direction.
At the same time, Meghan continues to build her projects and expand her brand independently, but the balance surrounding that royal connection appears to be evolving, raising a question that continues to linger: what does this shift ultimately lead to next? Without that same level of institutional backing shaping the narrative, how does perception change in high-level spaces, and what becomes the defining factor that sets her apart moving forward? These are the kinds of questions that keep this situation compelling to watch, especially as everything unfolds without the need for loud conflict or dramatic responses. The Crown has not relied on public confrontation to respond, but instead has adjusted quietly and continued forward, while behind the scenes.
Why did Harry put out his press release at exactly the same time William was the focus of global attention?
William and his team have focused on long-term stability, building a structure designed to hold its strength over time. That is where real influence becomes visible, not in volume, but in control, in timing, and in understanding exactly how the system works. And now that you have seen how all of this has been unfolding behind the scenes, the question turns to you. Do you think royal titles should be reserved only for those actively serving, and does stepping away mean leaving everything behind? If this made you think, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow Palace Loop, and share your thoughts in the comments below.